Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome everyone to our last final session of the conference. We are very happy to welcome our guests of the roundtable that we are going to have today. Professor Ewa Domańska from Adam Mickiewicz University, Poznań. Professor Ewa Kovács from Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, Professor Feldman from Gurion University of the Negev, and Professor Daniel Levy from Stony Brook University, New York. Hello, it's very good to see you again at this conference. The purpose of our meeting today is to summarize the conference and to map the recent development in Holocaust memory research, and also to reflect on the condition of Holocaust memory today in the context of globalization of Holocaust memory, but also the so-called third wave of memory studies as named by Astrid Earle. And it was yesterday very well put by Professor Daniel Levy, this tension that we are dealing in the course of this conference between the decontextualization and recontextualization of the Holocaust. Before we go on and start our discussion, I would like to invite everyone to participate in this meeting by asking questions, sending us your comments, your summaries, and anything you would like to share with us, and be part of this discussion. You may send your comments via email. The address is genealogies at ENRS EU, or just use the option Q&A on Zoom. So it seems that there have been three significant directions present during the conference. First was focus on the so-called overlooked local context throughout the processes of universalization and globalization of the Holocaust cultural meanings. A return to the local and endemic historical sources, languages, archives, landscape, and environmental and natural environment, and also the use of grounded theory instead of master lines of scholarly interpretation. Secondly, the growing and increasingly skillful use of digital and social media in dealing with the past, in presenting, experiencing, commemorating, and witnessing, and also in connecting the past to the present. And thirdly, it was putting the Holocaust in broader comparative perspective with other genocides and atrocities, and especially connecting it to the decolonial discourses. And for example, during the presentations, we had a presentation on the Great Calcutta killings in 1946, or references to present occurrences, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. So my questions to our guests today is, how do these trends reframe our understanding of the Holocaust as regards one or more of the major areas of the Holocaust memory discourse? And these are, for example, representation versus authenticity, witnessing, testimony, and authority, communities of remembrance and modes of identification with Holocaust memory, the role of media and medialization, and the national versus the transnational, and finally the ethical challenges, the connections with the present, the questions of education and young generations, or maybe a discussion on the notion of the implicated subject as introduced by Michael Rothberg recently. So I would like to ask our guests now to give us some thoughts about these, and if I may, I would like to start with Professor Daniel Levy.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to try and make, I hear myself double. Is that a problem, or can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. So, sorry about that. So I'd like to make very brief comments on all three of these issues, and let me start with a provocation that pertains to the allegedly overlooked local context. For one, I wonder whether the local contexts are really that understudied, considering the proliferation of local and micro-histories. Nothing to say of the growing strength of oral history, which on a side note, I think, benefited from the memory boom of the last 3 decades. And I have to admit that my view might be over-determined by the amount of historians who are flocking to the memory fields with an open mind. Possibly because they remain marginal in mainstream historiography, but judging from your program, the programs of the MSA, and a recently held conference by the Post-Socialist and Comparative Memory Studies Working Group, which is part of the Memory Studies Association, there are tons of local studies. However, that is not my main concern here, and forgive me if the following comes off as hyper-theoretical. That is intentional. For one, I think as scholars, we need to be aware that we not only use concepts, but also generate them. That is, the tools we use to study reality become part of that reality. Consequently, the local context must always be situated in a relational matrix. The reason I'm mentioning this rather obvious dictum is because there seems to be a conflation by suggesting that the local serves as fertile ground for grounded theory. Not only is this not necessarily the case, but I think grounded theory itself needs to be interrogated. At the least, it should not be presented as the solution to the problematic grand theories that posited some kind of linearity. However, I do not think that we can dispense with conceptual frameworks altogether. That was also my response yesterday about the usefulness of cosmopolitan sociology, precisely because the tension between the universal and the particular, which is structuring most memory narratives today, that was not always the case. There was an admittedly short period, roughly from the late 19th century, to the end of the 20th century, where the particular local in policies and in academia was theoretically and empirically relegated to the margins, because we were drunk on narratives of progress, and modernization theories became the new mission civilisatrice. Attempts by the West to control the rest might persist. However, there's one big difference. You or we are de facto cosmopolitan scholars and scholarly cosmopolitans. We are no longer providing the raw materials for all kinds of national teleologies, but on the contrary, we are challenging them and the underlying ideological assumptions guiding them. All of this to say that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If I have another minute, I'd like to briefly say something about the growing and increasingly skillful use of digital and social media. During a panel at the second annual conference of the Memory Studies Association in 2018, the historian Wolf Kannsteiner made what was then a provocative intervention when suggesting that the next frontier would be, say, Holocaust video games. There was some ooh-ah in the packed auditorium, and this was, of course, on the background of comparable earlier debates about Holocaust trivialization, Holocaust banalization, etc. Well, 2 years later, the Holocaust is thematized on TikTok, to name but one social media platform where all kinds of educational and not so educational Holocaust images, memes appear. Doesn't really matter what I personally think about this. What matters is how we proceed with this emerging media sphere and all it entails. And here I would like to suggest that we do not only talk about the era of the witness, but complement it with the era of the bystander. That is, Zeitzeugen, eyewitnesses are different from, say, the post-war generation witnessing Nazi trials. The same distinction also applies to the bystander, from the actual event to what Alison Landsberg has referred to as prosthetic memory. That is a highly mediated memory. Let me end here with an observation that seems pertinent to this distinction. Memories are embedded in time and its appropriate modes of commemoration. I don't know, hero worship at the end of the 19th century. And memories are depending on timing. That is, the generational differences to remembered event also shapes mnemonic possibilities. Lastly, yes to comparisons with regard to cases. And it seems clear from some of what Professor Lim yesterday suggested, this also extends to studying the motivations behind these comparisons. So let me end here.
Thank you very much. We will continue on that. Now I would like to ask Professor Kovács to give her thoughts.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's my honor to be together with you here and discuss the third wave of memory studies or memory politics this afternoon. Most memory scholars argue that Holocaust provides the foundations for a new global memory that transcends ethnic and national boundaries. The concept of global or cosmopolitan memory, as Daniel Levy mentioned a couple of minutes ago, transcends ethnic and national boundaries. The concept of global or cosmopolitan memory criticizes current memory politics in Europe that insists on the national character of collective memories. It's based on a proposal in which public thinking and remembering need moral frameworks in an age of uncertainty and the absence of master narratives about values and ideologies. The Holocaust became the archetypical genocide in European memory politics, and genocide experts often criticize this phenomenon because it resulted in a tendency to focus upon a few instances of genocide, alongside which the Holocaust, Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, and the former Yugoslavia can be included. They also stress that the influence of the Holocaust model has been to overemphasize the role of a narrow political ideology in genocide. By placing the Holocaust in a special class of allegedly ideological genocides, other allegedly utilitarian genocides, such as those in the European colonies, civil wars, etc., remain underrepresented in the arena of European memory politics. On the other hand, the Western standards of Holocaust commemorations have become constitutive parts of European norms and values, and a categorical imperative for newcomers to the European Union. The asymmetry of remembrance between Nazism and communism and the compulsion to conform with the memory standards of the Holocaust resulted in a wide variety of comparisons, not only the historian debates, but also in the deepest beliefs of ordinary people in the East European societies. To make the picture more complicated, looking at the battlefield of comparative victimhood, some scholars criticize the takeover of recognition politics that has destabilized political and historical representation in Europe and ended up undermining European integration of different pasts. They argue that it led to the rise of a new and inherently non-democratic foundationalism, which makes historic memory the prey of moralizing narratives that reduce historical complexity to black and white lessons and incite a symbolic struggle of mutual degradation. However, this is just one side of the coin. In the past 3 decades, commemorations of the victims became regular social events in schools, the media, and other public spaces. The history of the lost Jewish communities found more or less its place in local museums and exhibitions. Old synagogues and Jewish cemeteries have been renovated and incorporated into the international tourism of Jewish heritage. In addition, the cumulative attendance to the communist past has favored a series of new research projects that have explored, mapped, and conceptualized the white spots on the national histories. This knowledge enriches scholarly discourses and permanently challenges exhibitions, narrations, museum concepts, and governmental memory politics. And last but not least, with the cultural and forensic turn, the meaning of locality, landscape, and case study method found its appropriate place in Holocaust remembrance and historiography, and represents a return from the classical document-based history to the survivors' testimonies and the material objects of Nazi crimes. On the one hand, these new studies reflect on the intercultural, multi-religious, and transnational legacies of genocide, using not only the tools of archaeological methods, history writing, and anthropology, but also the leftover effect of political interventions, transnational justice, and commemorative practices. Situated always in a specific locality, where in many cases the invisible but contaminated landscape is part of everyday forgetting, searching for the past can generate formative changes in local remembrance practices. Moreover, problematizing the dignity of the local victims, the right for mourning, the emotional understanding of crime, all these questions touch upon fundamental ethical issues. While on the other hand, however, precisely because of the intercultural orientation and political embedment, these fieldworks also are subjugated to the political instrumentalization and the assertion of cultural and religious sensitivity. So to sum up, whether it be local or global, European or post-colonial, the memory of the Holocaust cannot be a refuge against the uncertainties of the moment.
Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to Professor Domańska. Professor Domańska, hello.
Thank you very much for invitation, and let me start with a short quotation from an excellent article by Karol Kajderman, The Perfect Failure. Karol is an anthropologist who is studying spaces of killing in Cambodia, and is considering how Holocaust studies, and especially Holocaust way of commemorization, marks a kind of is a spark of imperialism, intellectual imperialism, which is spread in non-Western countries. So the quotation is as follows. The intervention of Euro-Western genocide commemorations in non-Euro-Western cosmologies of memory marks a new form of imperialism. So, and she is talking about memorialization, the model of memorialization, which is generated by Holocaust studies. So my question would be, can we talk about the intellectual coloniality of the Holocaust and how we can actually discuss the problem of imposing the Holocaust model of commemorization on non-Western groups, especially in Cambodia when we deal with Buddhist society, where especially in rural spaces, the collective memorialization is absolutely unknown. So the author is asking how this idea that we should collectively commemorate victims and how this memory should be institutionalized is a way of, or a kind of extension of intellectual imperialism. So this is my first question and comment. The second one is related to the problem of holographic witnessing. I think it's a phenomenal problem, and this is something that Professor Levy and Professor Feldman is also working on. And so how we can talk about the ethics of witnessing while the witness, of course, with the permission, is turned into holograph, how it pushes us to rethink what witnessing is about and who is the witness. So I think that we putting the witness in a digital space push us to rethink all the idea of witnessing, especially if we might communicate with this holographic witness, ask the questions, and somehow enter into a dialogue. And the third comment is related to new approaches to Holocaust studies. And I am particularly fascinated with all these prefixes like eco, geo, phyto, necro, neuro, zoo, techno, and so on and so forth. And how the comparative genocide studies, including, of course, the Holocaust, might profit from current research in comparisons between, for example, human and animal slavery, human and animal Holocaust. I know that the term Holocaust is overused, but I think that especially in the current situation, when we are dealing again with the problem of dehumanization, which should be again reconceptualized in the current theoretical framework. So how these current tendencies might help us to revitalize Holocaust studies, because my personal feeling is that the memory studies in the Holocaust discourse reach some kind of theoretical conclusion. And even if you have excellent case studies, from theoretical point of view, I don't think that we profit by including more and more case studies into our discussions about the memory. So I think that we might somehow think about going beyond trauma studies, memory studies in the Holocaust research, and perhaps move to a different area. And of course, my personal interest lies in environmental humanities and relationship between ecocides and genocides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will come back to the questions that you have just asked. They are very important. But now I would like to ask Professor Jackie Feldman to give us his observations.
Thank you very much. I think that the shift from analog to digital technologies, digital and social technologies, can make us more aware of the role that technology plays in determining what is memory. Just as the age of the witness was ushered in with the Yale Video Archive, quoting Amit Pinchevsky, so too we have to ask what kinds of memory, what changes of memory of the Holocaust result from the diffusion of digital and social media. And I chose to focus on selfies simply as one exemplary example, and one would certainly need to include the holograms, virtual reality, the games, the interactive games that Kahnsteiner, I would almost say, is promoting as a kind of paradigm, and others. As I see it, some of the changes or some of the questions that are posed by the change to a digital generation, and I think we need to take that very seriously, that the use of digitalization and social media change fundamentally, right, make a fundamental break between the previous generation and this one. As I see them, the first question is that of social solidarity. Can one hold a commemoration online? How much is bodily presence, co-presence necessary for us to remember together? What kinds of communities of memory are constructed through internet, through Facebook, through other communities? And what kinds of communities that we assumed as taken for granted perhaps function much less if people can be co-present, but not really present to each other because each one is now communicating with their friends on Facebook. One is no longer in the same time of commemoration. The commemoration, the co-presence doesn't create the same demand on one's time because one is always waiting for, how am I going to look on the frame? how many likes am I going to get? That will determine what the experience is to begin with, and not the after effects of the experience. This is not a question that is simply, of course, focused on Holocaust memory. It also is a general question of what kinds of ethical worlds can exist in a social media dominated society. Already 20 years ago, Dean McCannell, in a book called The Ethics of Tourism, said that the difference between a front stage and a backstage of society is essential for any sense for any ethics. If the gap between a front stage and backstage is too great, then we call it hypocrisy. But if there is no backstage at all, then everything that we do becomes exemplary, right? So that the Facebook, the selfie picture of someone doing balancing act on the rails or jumping from stone to stone at the Holocaust Memorial doesn't become a kind of understandable human weakness, but a paradigm of this is the way things should be. See Trump. Okay. The second area that I think that is important is the question of authority. The rapid diffusion of information, of images, means that the caretakers of Holocaust memory, whether they be museum curators, whether they be scholars or teachers, are being constantly challenged by a huge flow of information that's a very often undifferentiated information that's coming over and that can present itself to many people as real news. And do we, let's say, as scholars of Holocaust memory, the possibility anymore of making that distinction, of giving the critical tools that will allow people to distinguish between real news and fake news, to place satires in their place, and if not, how does one then react? Is any engagement, even with fake news, something that is to be welcomed in a world where everything vanishes with the next flick of the cursor on the screen? So that's the question of authority. And the authority is related to bodily presence. If one is there together, it's enough to say, get off those rails, and it's done. But if it goes on to the talkbacks, if it goes on to the internet, then just becomes the 7th and the 26th talkback, and one's authority can constantly be challenged. The third, if I spoke of social solidarity and the question of the hierarchies of authority, I think that the third issue is that of what is witnessing and how important is the body in witnessing. I argued that the body of the person taking the selfie is now becoming as the replacement for the body of the witness. If the body of the witness is no longer there because the witnesses are no longer alive, how do we reestablish a hierarchy between authoritative representations of the body of the witness and others, and that of the selfie taker? Or is the notion of the presence of the body and the figure, the visibility of the witness, no longer important? And what does that say about other forms of authenticity at museums, like that of artifacts, like that of places, when so much is being formed and reformed through the images that are transmitted so far on screen? And finally, I want to suggest that even in the face of a global force like the internet, that we should still continue to hold in mind to what extent do local differences matter. For one, in areas between North and South where internet technologies are not as available, or between people of different generations where for older people they are disempowered by their lack of familiarity with internet technologies. Or, I might argue, even when images and information circulate worldwide, to what extent do older communities still segment that information and create subgroups? I suggest perhaps that the willingness and the approval, even by more official authorities, of selfies and these representations in the Israeli case have something to do with the importance that was already given to bodily presence on sites of death as a statement of national victory or national revenge. And that may not be the same when we look at other, in this case, national or other communities. So let's not just take for granted that this internet and social media are a completely leveling force. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There were many important observations, and of course it is difficult to put it all together, but I think there is one matter that you all agree, and this is actually also the direction we hinted at during this conference, that we are in a new phase, as a new stage in both the processes of commemorating, remembering the Holocaust, and in memory research. Each of you have actually addressed it in different ways, and this refers both to social and cultural reality and the present context, as well as to academia, to research, and to the studies. So in order to investigate, to dig a little bit deeper into the social, political context of the present, I would like to ask you to try to define what have been the recent changes that influence such dynamics of Holocaust memory. Certainly, we are in a different place than we were 2 decades ago, when already many of us thought that it is some kind of the end of history in Holocaust memory, and the proclaimed global, in somewhat, I am being provocative now, triumphalist way, global Holocaust memory, unifying groups and nations. We see that we are at a different place right now. And I would like to ask you a question in this context, because it seems to me that there have been at least two different possible models of universalizing the Holocaust, the meaning of the Holocaust, the European and the American model. So the American was more about the identification with the victims and solidarizing with the victims, whereas the specifically European model, inspired by the German processes of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, has developed into a kind of perpetrators' memory, identification more with the groups that have been responsible for the Holocaust, and also the passive bystanders, the groups that have been complicit in the Holocaust. So we have two different models of Holocaust memory. Both of them have the potential of universalization. The question is which of them has been prevailing in globalizing Holocaust memory, and also how you see the dynamics and the relation between them, both in the course of globalization as well as the current backlash against it. And I will turn now to our speakers, asking them for some reflections on them. Would any one of you like to begin? Professor Levy?
Well, I think I'm not sure if I entirely agree with your depiction of the kind of two strands that you're describing. I think in part there's one fallacy in the argument that is presupposing that there's one European model. I think part of the conference is precisely about how the Holocaust. I think we have to look at if the political class used the Holocaust as a cipher to unite Europe. Of course, there are different factions now, national, local, grassroots, other political elites who are using it for the exact opposite purpose. So I think our attempt to kind of control what the narrative of the Holocaust is undermining the very purpose of interrogating how memory tropes can be used, are appropriated, are depending on the local context, are depending on generational changes, are depending on changes in the media that we use. Hutton makes this very clear. He says the entire history of memory studies is the history of changing media, and this is not a Lewin-esque claim about the medium is the message. It's always about how we use the media, of course, but he makes it very clear. I mean, Plato already was complaining about the invention of script because it would destroy our ability to memorize and so on and so forth. So what has print done and so on and so forth. So we're just now at the next frontier that Jackie described so well. So I don't think the kind of idea to control, I think it's actually antithetical to the enterprise. I also think it's ethically problematic, but that's another issue. So in other words, there's no one narrative, and that's okay.
Okay, would any one of you like to reflect on that too? Professor Kovács.
So I would also like to stress that I am not really agree with the concept that the European memory were concentrated on the form of perpetrator. Recognizing the position of the perpetrator in the memory politics. This is a German model. If you look your country or my country, Hungary or Austria, this is the western part of France, you can observe that the victimhood played a formative role in this story, and you can also recognize many waves of victim narrations and victim, so establishing the position of the victim in the discourse, and many frustrations of the survivors. Then they recognize that this type of commemoration doesn't work pretty well. So I'm not sure that we can say that this is a European form of memory politics and a non-European form of memory politics. Moreover, I'm not so skeptical because I think the post-memory plays in many communities a very important role still. So if you see what is happening in the second and third and fourth generation of Jewish communities in Hungary, then you will observe that these generations want to find new avenues to understand the position, the history of the parents, grandparents on the one hand, and touching upon the ethical questions, also developing a kind of citizenship positions on the basis of these experiences. So the victimhood can have a new dimension in the post-memory. And this third point I also wanted to discuss in my first short talk, that the most complicated is these comparative victimhood, which was produced as a European game. It was not produced by Hungarians or by Poles or by Russians, or etc. It was part of the European identity game, and it makes our life extremely complicated, because if you just work on the concept of victimhood, then it's extremely difficult to make a kind of active citizenship position. So an active agency, how you can be active as a social agent when you are always in the victim position, and you will be always pushed back by the political discourse into this victim position. So I think the situation is more complicated than we can summarize it in these two forms of memory politics.
Thank you very much. And Professor Feldman?
Yeah, if I may, I think that one of the things that might be interesting to look at is to see, and Professor Domańska related to it when she's citing Karol Kidron's work, to see how these along what paths of power these various victim narratives or victim identifications travel. To what extent does the way one identifies as a victim influenced, say, by the Me Too movement? To what extent does Black Lives Matter and the Holocaust identification, how people present themselves, intersect? To what extent does a majority and minority, does a Turkish migrant to Germany need to acknowledge his guilt in order to become seen as more German within the society? Or, and what is the various, prices and if you like, almost advantages of adopting a victim narrative or victim identification? On the one hand, it is perhaps a way of saying, okay, I'm entitled to certain rights because I have suffered, right? I have suffered perhaps at your hands, whoever that your is majority. On the other hand, I'm reminded of something that Zygmunt Bauman wrote about 15 years ago. He wrote an article called Victims by Proxy, where he says the problem with victims by proxy is that victims don't live in homes, they live in fortresses, and they need them to be constantly under fire. And so this is something I certainly see locally in terms of the adoption of the Holocaust victim narrative in Israel. We're all victims, so therefore, the world is a fortress, and we need to be strong and defend ourselves. So these are some of the power issues that to me occur. Yeah.
Thank you very much. When I asked these questions, I meant rather the dominating ideological, paradigmatic interpretations within Holocaust studies, but you have rightly brought in the dimension of the individual too, right? Because it's not only about collective social, national, transnational memories, but also about individual identification. And I would still like to dwell a bit on the issue of these positions between as you said, the movement, the Me Too movement. It is easy to identify with victims. It is also quite often easy. Well, in fight against the perpetrators, in the book on the implicated subject, Michael Rothberg writes that he wants to transgress these divisions into victims, perpetrators, and the bystanders, and he introduces a new category. What is your stand on that? How do you think that the notion of implicated subject can vitalize our reflection within Holocaust studies by connecting it to the present? And what are the limits of that? I would like to hear your opinion. Professor Kovács.
I really like this book. I read it a couple of months ago, and this is why I loved it. Is the point I mentioned it already, that Rothberg is thinking about the possibilities of being active, being an active individual in the world in which every day we are implicated with many crimes. Via media, via social media, via neighborhood violences, etc. So, and I think it really makes the analytical thinking easier with this book, because then we can differentiate, as you mentioned, Małgorzata, between victims, perpetrators, and bystanders, because we can also work with the question of implication, and how deep this implication is, etc. So I really liked this book. I don't know how we can apply it into fieldwork or case studies, but the book was very inspiring.
Thank you. I would like to bring to the discussion the question asked by Professor Domańska. Can we talk about the intellectual coloniality in Holocaust discourse? I hope it interplays somehow with the question that I'm going to read now, sent to us by from the audience. I'm reading it. Along with the passing time, not only do we come to the moment when no victims and witnesses will be alive, but also more and more other traumatic events happen, which also must be researched and commemorated. Therefore, apart from guarding the memory of the victims of Shoah, are we facing the need to compete with new victims, and can the methods of Holocaust research save its memory, since the researchers of the genocide in Cambodia, Yugoslavia, etc., have to refer to the Holocaust studies? What do you think of that? Professor Domańska.
Well, why do you think that the scholars working on memory and violence, for example, in Latin America or Australia or Canada, and I think especially about indigenous scholars, why they have to refer to Holocaust? I think that some of them would actually talk about decolonization precisely in this way, that the Holocaust is not the reference point. And of course, I'm not advocating that. I'm just trying to find a way to think about, for example, how we can discuss Holocaust research, the future of Holocaust research from non-Western perspective, by which I mean, can we as Holocaust scholars learn something from scholars working on violence, mass killing, and that are reluctant to take to have the Holocaust as a kind of archetype. And I would like to refer to an excellent article by Eva Kovács on universalization of the limits of universalizations, where Eva is talking about, competing memories. And I think that in some regions, the competition is set in this way that, for example, some memory studies are not taken into consideration. So, for example, because, let's say that in Poland we compete between Katyn and Auschwitz, and we know that from some political view, it's better just to marginalize memory studies developed within the Holocaust studies in order to somehow develop the memory of the community, right? So it's not only about non-European regions, but it's also about, as it was said before, about the different regions within the Europe, which are different, like Balkans and Scandinavia and East Central Europe, with its own political issues, I would say. So my question was why we should assume that the Holocaust should be a reference point for memory studies in many different, concerns about violence.
Yes. Would any of you would like to refer to this question now?
I think there is a certain, yeah.
Okay. Okay, Professor Feldman and
Go
then
ahead,
Professor
please.
Levy. Professor Feldman, please.
I think there's a certain amount of faith that I think we as scholars, as well as many educators, have in the kind of in the work that we're doing on Holocaust memory. that is that, you know, somehow beyond our criticism, beyond our investigations and deconstruction, that you know, if maybe I'm wrong in speaking for others, that if properly done, the memory of the Holocaust will have a healing effect, will sensitize people against the next genocide, against the all kinds of injustices. And you know, maybe it's that faith that keeps us going. But all the time, this is, you know, as we know, one needs to pose the questions to it. My ex-student Leah David wrote a book called "The Past Can't Heal You." Well, maybe maybe it can't. Is it our job, in order to keep that faith, you know, to keep that faith alive as scholars?
Professor
Back
Levy.
on that, in the sense that, first of all, I think we need to be very clear about distinguishing Holocaust studies from memory studies, even if there's an overlap, in the sense that Holocaust scholars engage and have to make decisions about what levels and modes of comparison are acceptable. This is all very different in the realm of memory studies, where we're talking about commemorative genres that travel and are adopted because people need it to be legitimate, and what Eva says about how this is a kind of intellectual imperialism. At that point, I'm not so sure I see that in the context of historiographical comparisons. I want to follow up on the suggestion of Jackie about what I guess would today be called our positionality. You know, I mean, I find it telling that we study things that are not part of our own experience, so to speak. And here I think, represent, that's a problem in knowledge production in general. I think we are old. I'm sorry, I speak for myself. Okay, but we're not that generation that Jackie and some of us are studying. So there's always a little bit of an element of moral panic amongst us. I would say, for instance, the notion of corporality that we talked about before. When I look at my daughter, who is 15, and do I need to say anything else? That itself speaks. You can imagine what that means. Corporality. There's the social media is an extension of her social life. Actually, most of the social media takes place with the people who are near her. That is borne out by research. And I agree with Jackie. What is the meaning of this for, say, a sentiment like friendship today? In other words, we look at this historically, we look at it with a distance. This is 500 likes is not my idea of friendship. I have 3 friends, and so on and so forth. So, you know, we are in the middle of witnessing a transformation of basic social concepts and modes of social interaction. And I think it pays if sometimes we recognize our positionality. I'm speaking for myself. I know that Jackie, as an anthropologist, is way ahead of the game in that respect. But I think sometimes it bears reminding ourselves.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience by Zofia Wójcicka, and she writes, it seems to me that this is that almost all has been already said in Holocaust research, and we have to search for totally new paradigms like eco-Holocaust, etc., is quite problematic. Holocaust research is not only about memory and trauma, but also about history of the first grade. In this field, there is lots of very, very interesting and important groundbreaking research being done in the in the last years. For example, by the Polish Center for Holocaust Research, conducted by Barbara Engelking, Jacek Leociak, or Jan Grabowski. Surely new approaches can offer new insights, but just new because it is new. What do you think of that?
I have to say something about it before we get into a serious discussion. I'd like to quote the famous German anarchist and comedian Karl Valentin, and I think he speaks and reflects what academia is about. Everything has already been said, just not by everyone. So I think that dictum unfortunately holds true for academia, but now I'm going to let my colleagues make some serious comments about the question.
Thank you.
Well, I feel that I feel a kind of call, so I should reply. So I'm working on new tendencies, new approaches, emerging fields in the humanities and social sciences, and that's why I'm focusing on ideas that I feel are somehow developing, generating interesting. Ideas also within the fields of Holocaust studies. What I mean by pushing it is by giving us a different understanding from from the research which are done in more traditional way. I am not saying that they are better. I am not saying that I fully agree with them. I'm just saying that, for example, if you really want to publish, at least in some American journals, some interesting article, you better focus not only on well-done research, but also on interesting, innovative approach, right? So this is at least my experience with publishing abroad. So of course, I do understand that there are still phenomenal and actually important research which are in the conventional history and so on and so forth. But this is not my point of interest. I'd rather try to find out what is the future of Holocaust studies in the situation when we are facing generational gap that it was said here, and we have to produce knowledge that would attract young people. And these young people are not necessarily interested in the same stuff that we have been working on. They like kinky stuff. And that's why it's better if the advisor is already having something under control and might suggest some new ways of doing research, then some uncontrolled, let's say, situation happened, and I know some cases like that. So what I'm saying is that, of course, new is not necessarily better, especially in terms of well-done research, and we still have to do empirical, normal research. This is absolutely the base. But I think that if you want to keep the Holocaust studies going as a kind of leading field in genocide studies, we have to be pragmatic and also make some research about what is going on in contemporary humanities and social sciences and how the Holocaust studies might contribute and might take part in the discussion about, let's say, Anthropocene humanities, zoohumanities, transspecies psychology, and so on and so forth. I think there is a lot to be it's a lot that the Holocaust studies might contribute to this research.
Professor Domańska, and I would also like to ask you, yesterday Professor Levy was quite critical about comparisons, using Holocaust comparisons, for example, in the context of ecological Holocaust. You mentioned it as an overuse. So I would like to ask you, Professor Domańska, to what extent we can think of the environmental research-inspired Holocaust studies as going in the direction of universalization, decontextualization, trying to see it more contemporarily, and to what extent is it return to the local context, so the recontextualization process. I am very much intrigued by this juxtaposition of these contextualizations.
Well, first of all, I am absolutely sure, and I say it with a full intellectual responsibility, that the relationship between ecocides and genocides are absolutely crucial for the genocide research. Because the environmental violence, it is very much related with social violence, with violence against humans. And I'm not speaking about the Holocaust only right now. I'm speaking general about genocide and ecocide studies. More, ecocide studies, genocide studies, and the problem of epistemicide, geography of knowledge, is also something that needs to be carefully considered also within the Holocaust studies. And I'm coming back to the idea how we can use the post-colonial approach to production of knowledge within the Holocaust studies. So for me, there is a lot of relationship between ecocide, genocide, and epistemicide. Of course, this is not my idea. I like Latin American scholars and Enrico Dussel and Quijano and Nignolo. So I approach this idea also from the point of view of non-Western, non-American scholars, because I feel that a lot of interesting push is coming from Latin America right now. But this is one way. Now about environmental violence and Holocaust, or environmental Holocaust and Holocaust of humans. Of course, there was always a problem how the notion of a Holocaust is used in many different contexts, and it's always problematic. And it's always that we have to be somehow responsible and think not only about what we are doing as intellectuals right now, but how our research might be used in the future. And I do understand the skepticism of many scholars who do not really like the idea of comparing environmental Holocaust with Holocaust of people. However, again, if we think about how, for example, the notion of Holocaust is used in a productive and proper way, when, for example, we are talking about spiritual Holocaust of Native Americans, when we are talking about how the culture genocide is related to state-sponsored environmental violence, I would say that all this concern altogether is giving us a kind of more holistic picture of the Holocaust as the paradigm of total destruction. So I do understand that only for Holocaust studies scholars, this might be very problematic. But if we think about the Holocaust as a kind of paradigm for the total destruction, I see a lot of possibilities to find common grounds. And I think that especially if we want to be future-oriented, we better join the forces and talk about comparative genocide studies in a more integral and holistic way. I would also say that I would very much welcome more positive views on how Holocaust studies might actually revitalize our hope into the future, and not only focus on what kind of traumatic events it produced. What I'm saying is that, for example, I do like and I do cherish the idea of Ariela Azoulay of potential history. And she recommends to focus on these events that shows the unfulfilled potential that might be bring back or revitalize for the future purposes. So, for example, when I am thinking about a relationship between ecocide and genocide, I would say, okay, what we can learn about positive social practices of people who are deeply involved in saving human life as well as saving nature for the future of our communities and the future of Earth in general. I know that this is not probably the most convincing answer, but I would be very future oriented and think about the development of genocide studies not only in short terms, but also think about how it might look like in 100 years and how we can preserve the memory, because I feel that sometimes Holocaust studies are too short-sight oriented.
Thank you very much. Since I mentioned Professor Levy, would you like to at bottom say something to what Professor Domańska said, or do we move on to the next question?
Well, no, I just want to make one comment, and that pertains to the difference between comparative genocide studies, which should include the ecocide, as you say, and the kind of mere metaphorical deployment of the Holocaust notion, which is falls a little short of what you would consider a comparative study. So, I mean, already, I think it's 20 years ago that Mike Davis wrote The Late Victorian Holocaust and used that, and people were rather upset. I have a feeling people are less concerned with the metaphorical deployment. But if I were to say comparative genocide studies and ecocide, then I would say, no, the Holocaust is not a good comparison. Why not go to a genocide where systematic deprivation of water or removal of groups from certain natural resources? You know, there's enough comparative here. What would the Holocaust, from a historical perspective, provide us here, other than, as you say, being a cipher for total destruction? And I can think of other ciphers of total destruction that might be even more relevant. So I'm not. This is not so much to kind of undermine what you're saying, but kind of unpack and say what can be compared and what is merely quote unquote metaphorical reference. So, but that's a minor issue.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting reversal of perspectives. And also I was intrigued by the notion of a Holocaust memory in 100 years. Since we have questions from the audience, more questions, I will now move to them. One very interesting from Norma Musich. I hope I'm pronouncing your name rightly. How do you think digital and social media affect the formation of the implicated subject? I think it's turn now for Professor Feldman and Professor Kovács.
Norma Musich is my postdoctoral assistant, so I'd rather she knows what I have to say, but I would like to hear if others have some reflections. Yeah.
But definitely the rest of the audience will want to know what you have to say about it.
Well, actually, I'm not sure. Does many of these, at least some of the the social media, like the selfies, to what extent does the issues around the complex positioning of the implicated subject, to what extent can these be transmitted through media like selfies? I don't know. Is it? It seems that the way that they're photographed, the way that they're posted, I'm not sure. Certainly, one could post it, onto a network. That what would happen if it was posted onto onto Me Too, onto Black Lives Matter, as saying, me too. I'm not a victim of sexual violence, but my grandmother was, so I've inherited it. Or I'm trying to think out loud, but I don't have a good handle on it. Perhaps with other forms of social media it might be otherwise, but I'd be glad to hear what others have to say.
Yes, Professor Kovács.
I have an enigmatic example from Hungary, whether you can say Hungary in the social media, a Hungarian example. So it was 5 years ago or 4 years ago when this criminal memorial of the German occupation was unveiled in Budapest. Probably you still remember, all newspapers were full of the story. It represented the Hungarian victimhood during Second World War, and suddenly in the Facebook a group was formed. The name is Holocaust and My Family, and this group was established by family members of the second and third generation survivors, and it still exists. So they work together since more than 5 years. These family members share the memory of the families with pictures, stories, testimonies, etc. And later on, these testimonies were performed in a theater performance and then published in a very, very old-fashioned book. So you can see the movement from the absolutely modern way of social media back to the book. And if you see it, some scholars analyzed the text they published, and they are testimonies never published before. It means for me as a sociologist that it's still a social hope or need to have this type of communication for the third and fourth generations. And it was open. It was an open group. You can also take part. You can also add your questions, and you can commemorate together within this Facebook group. So it can also work, I guess, not with selfies, more maybe, but with testimonies, with family photos, with discussing and remembering together in the platform of this old-fashioned Facebook social media.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Usually it is that the digitalization and the digital media have only one session at conferences, and very often at the very end. So I think that we are still trying to define the mechanisms and to understand how the social media with regards to memory work, but it also seems more and more important subject. There is another question from one of the conference participants to Ida Richter. I have a question to Professor Daniel Levy. She writes, in various publications, you have identified the connection between human rights discourse and Holocaust memory as a main indicator of a cosmopolitization of Holocaust memory since the 1990s. I wondered if you could comment on the historical development of this connection. Contrary to the common assumption that the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was influenced by the experience of the Holocaust, historians of human rights such as Samuel Moyn have recently argued that human rights and Holocaust memory were not yet connected in the 1940s, but that this might only have evolved from the 1970s on. I wondered if you could share your thoughts on the point of time of an intersection between human rights and Holocaust memory. Ida Richter, PhD student at the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies, Berlin, Brandenburg.
Yeah, I'm going to try and make that very short because there are some historical issues here at stake. I tend to agree that in the 40s, the connection between, say, the Genocide Convention and the Holocaust was tangential, was mostly in the form of biographical issues of the people who were coining and who were developing the Genocide Convention. Mostly, not mostly, but a lot of Jewish lawyers from the interwar period, Lemkin, Lauterbach, all kinds of people there. So there the connection was very clear. And it was very interesting to see that they made a great effort to actually leave the Holocaust out of the equation for kind of very narrow political reasons, because there are all these stories about, I think it was Lemkin who was talking with the people with Banish, but also with the German expelled and so on and so forth. There were all kinds of very strange compromises made in order to kind of make it a universal experience. So I agree that the Holocaust only very much later comes to intersect here with this issue. And I think we wrote about that quite clearly. I also want to say that the emphasis on the human rights regime and the Holocaust being so important, Holocaust memories being so important for it, and this kind of cross-fertilization between human rights discourse and Holocaust discourse was a time diagnostic. It was a particular moment in the 90s and early 2000s. So I yesterday in our talk, I kind of spoke at length about the misinterpretations of our thesis. We actually early on saw that the Holocaust would be a divisive issue, not just this kind of global cyber. So we have covered both issues. I do not think that the human rights norms still matter, but the human rights regime today is very weak in the sense that it still commands some normative attention, but basically it has been superseded by too many exceptions and so on and so forth. So human rights still matter, yes, and can still have some legitimatory purchase in international affairs and elsewhere, but are not nearly as powerful and as significant as they were at the time of that we documented. So I think they're actually moving apart. And I wonder if Holocaust memory from going, this is speculative, from if it once was the purview of, let's say, Jewish remembrance, then became spread out. I'm being very schematic here. I wonder if, given the identity politics that we are witnessing now, if they will soon become a Jewish memory only. This is also a possibility, right? Namely that one of the issues that in order to kind of get away from this so-called imperialism, every group will be, I'm not advocating for that, and personally I think it would not be a good thing in terms of politically speaking, but there's a possibility that the Holocaust at the end will belong, quote unquote, to Jewish memory alone. I don't know that, but you see what I'm trying to say here is that there are kind of competing movements. This is completely speculative.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To close soon our conference, I would like you maybe to give your last word of summary. What do you think would be the priorities for Holocaust memory studies in the next decade? And I would like to ask Professor Eva Kovács to begin.
It's always not easy to start to answer this question. My experience is working on the field since 30 years that every generation should find their way to commemorate something, not only the Holocaust, but any other historical event. And our task is to help finding this way for them, because I think we are actually on a level of saturation, and we just try to understand scholarly what is happening, and yes, hardly ever can take part in a commemoration which still moves. But I think the next generation has the possibility to find their way again, because this is the only way to commemorate it as a known experience. And I think this is the main important questions. Whether we can help to the next generation to find their authentic way of remembering.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And maybe Professor Feldman?
I feel always that I'm trying to, I have the sense, rather than being in control of, excuse the metaphor, but running after a train that's pulling out of the station. We talk about, how many of us talk about, well, when things get back to normal, right? I'm not sure if things will get back to the same normal that they were. We see this conference, just as an example, taking place here, on Zoom with meetings that can happen, and at the same time at the expense of other interactions that don't. We see the commemorations that have moved last year from place-based commemorations to things that are online. How I find myself in trying to catch up with what kinds of social solidarity, what kinds of forms of memory. My sense is that we're trying to imagine our lives in the buildings when we're still haven't dug out of the earthquake yet, or know exactly what its consequences are. I would hope that the kind of that we could bring a combination of a critical thinking and and an ethical hope to our work in ways that will, continue to inspire people to research, even in an age where so much seems to be either being flattened out by the media or being appropriated by national or by other groups for at least for reasons that I find unethical and a maybe even a desecration of the dead. But other people may disagree.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And maybe Professor Domańska?
Yeah, I think that this is the proper time that I can say what I learned from Holocaust studies and what helped me to survive this difficult period of pandemics being closed. I learned the most probably important things: how to adapt, and something about the resilience. And I do not. I do remember of this Holocaust testimonies of Borowski, Levy, and Semprún, and all these survivors. And I think that this is the time where I can when I can really use this knowledge. So when we are talking about preventive value of Holocaust studies, I don't know if they have preventive value, but I know that they can have adaptive value. If I do not learn from Holocaust memories on how to adapt, so what I could learn? And something about human solidarity, even in extreme situations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Professor Levy? We can't hear you. No?
I'm sorry.
Now
My first and honest answer is I don't know. I would be it would be arrogant of me to suggest I do know. I will say, looking at the field of knowledge production and where we are right now, I would say two things. no, let me say three things. I'm a sociologist. I have to stick to the three-partite division. One, I'm thinking of the notion of cultural memory that Jan Assmann proposed. And I'm thinking, what is that? That supposedly brings Germans back to the Teutoburger Wald. Nobody in Germany knows what the Teutoburger Wald is. What is the cultural memory? Where is the anchor? We presuppose there is such a thing, and there isn't. There used to be, maybe. Today there isn't. Teutoburger Wald is completely, I don't even know what it is, but I know it used to be important in German history. Okay? So that's the first thing. So I think the concept of cultural memory in the age of media technology maybe needs to be supplemented by a perpetual communicative memory. It's constant, it's ongoing, and past points are, there has to be some accounting for the speed with which all this happens. And I'm talking about a volatility, and I have no answer for it. But that's one thing. So I think in that respect, we have moved a little bit about, for the Holocaust specifically, from what does it mean to will it be meaningful? There seems to be some kind of collective anxiety here, like, will the Holocaust still be meaningful in 100 years, and so on and so forth, and for whom? Okay, that's the one thing. The second thing, if I look at the way things are produced in academia, I'm confident that we will continue to study it, if only because academia really is a field of product differentiation. Everybody will try and come up with an angle and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that, I'm part of that game. Those are the rules of the game on the field that we are on. So, and I'm not saying that cynically. I mean, this can be very productive. Some of it is what we would call narrish, but some of it is very kind of productive. So I'm not beating myself up. And lastly, I think, and that goes back to us, because we are old, we are West, there is still a great degree of Ungleichzeitigkeit ist gleichzeitig. That's to say, a dissimultaneity of the simultaneous. I'm not trying to go fancy here. I'm just mentioning it because that relates to the epistemological starting point from which different groups operate. So even the question, and this is of course a legitimate question, I don't want to answer the question because I'm only one part. So if we want to be true to the way in which these things operate, we have to invite more people for that question, to answer that question. I have no authority to answer that question. I'm returning this provocatively to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now thank you all for these very important and very stimulating words. Thank you for this whole discussion and for being with us today and throughout the conference. We have approached, after the whole month of meeting together online, we have approached the end, the last stop, when we have to close the conference. And I would like now to ask my colleague, Małgorzata Wosińska, the co-convenor, to say a few words.
Good afternoon, all. Dear guests of the roundtable discussion, dear audience. It's just a little summary and a little farewell from us. The aim of our conference was to assess the current state of Holocaust memory research. We wanted to discuss the interplay between the universal, global, cosmopolitan, transnational scale of Holocaust memory and that anchored in the endemic space and culture of historical experience, local, ethnic, environmental, national, as well as anchored in an anthropological experience, what was also very important for us. We were interested in the influences between the diverse mnemonic scales, including both mutual inspiration and conceptual misuses. Thus, we were asking questions of the ontological and ethical limits of mnemonic universalization on the one hand, and of micro-contextualization of memories and its needs of recontextualization on the other. I hope that we did manage, for sure we did manage to create a common, even virtual space, a place for dialogue, for discussion and intellectual discussion, and a place where past and present, from our perspective, could have been recognized with respect, with great respect, also as a kind of auto-reflective inspiration for the future. A moment ago, Professor Domańska, you were all talking about the future as well, but Professor Domańska also mentioned this future potential, foresight studies. And we do strongly believe it's necessary in 21st century, and with a hope for the better future and for the better world, despite all odds, despite all certainty and uncertainty. Better world for us, but also for non-human beings. And being grateful for all your wise input and engagement we have received for a whole last month, I would like to thank you all. And I would like to thank you especially to Małgorzata Pakier, a convener of this conference, to Gabor, from European Network and Solidarity, who was a great support, intellectual, logistical, technical. He was working with you all. And the same Antoni Zakrzewski from European Network, Remember Solidarity. Without all this support, it was the first time when we were organizing such a big conference online. So without all this support, without great technicians, with great logistical support, it wasn't be possible. Thank you also to Director of European Network Remember Solidarity, Rafał Rogulski, who trusted us that we could manage that we can manage to organize it in the time of pandemic. Thank you, our great keynotes. We have amazing keynotes. Piotr Cywiński, Director, Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum. Omer Bartow from Brown University. Eva Kovács, hello Eva. Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. Mindaugas Kwiatkowskas, Minister of Culture of the Republic of Lithuania. Professor Ewa Domańska. Hello, Eva. Adam Mickiewicz, University, Poznań. Professor Jackie Feldman. Good afternoon, Professor. From Gurion University of the Negev. Professor Daniel Levy. Hello, Daniel. From Stony Brook University, New York. We would like to say thank you very much to our key partners. Memorial to the Martyred Jews of Europe in Berlin. As well, our Department of Sociology at Warsaw University. Without your support, this conference wouldn't be possible. And our dear Academic Council. You are helping us from the early beginning to create this program. And I think this program, in the end, we can say that it was at least complementary, taking under consideration local and global, endemic and universal. Thank you, Małgorzata Głowacka, the Warsaw University, Leonin Bach, the Ghetto Fighters House Museum, Lachemei Hageteot, Israel, Adam Kerpel-Fronius from Memorial to the Martyred Jews of Europe, Audrey Kisielewski, Strasbourg University and Mémorial de la Shoah, Tamas Kovács, Holocaust Memorial Center, Bela Raski, Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, Roma Sendyka from Jagiellonian University. Also, thank you, Roma, for creating a special session number 4, overlooking the local dimensions of the Holocaust studies, language and the cultural spatial politics of transmission. Thank you, Hanna Węgrzynek from Warsaw Ghetto Museum, and Zofia Wójcicka from German Historical Institute. Also, thank you, Zofia, that you are always active and always providing us additional questions. It was very helpful for our debates. I would like to kindly ask you, dear audience, but also our keynote speakers who probably maybe missed another keynote speakers. All our sessions were recorded and you can find them on our conference website. Also, the video presentation, there were a few panelists who are choosing to give a video presentation and it wasn't included in the main program, so also, and we do believe they're really, really great, so you can also check it there. What I want to say more, just we are going to miss you, I'm going to miss you, and I do really believe that we'll meet soon. Maybe I hope that we are going to create a common monography after the conference. Thank you from my side. Good afternoon and goodbye.
And thank you very much to Małgorzata, also for co-convening, for joining us, for joining the European Network in this year's venture within our continuous program, Genealogies of Memory in Central and Eastern Europe. Yes, we might consider a publication, but regarding this, we will be contacting you afterwards separately. So this is the end now. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the European Network, Remembrance and Solidarity, I would like to invite you to watch a short pandemic spot to celebrate the 10th jubilee of our program. Thank you once again, and goodbye.
Genealogies of Memory was the first big project of the newly launched European Network Remembrance and Solidarity. With this project, we wanted to show the world, here we are. The original idea was born during a phone call between Professor Jan Rydl, Polish coordinator of the network, and me while we discussed the first possible activities of the network. We decided to organize an international conference with the view to bring together most prominent academics and most promising scholars dealing with the history and remembrance across the world. From the very beginning, it was meant to be a long-term project, with the first meeting focusing on a variety of methodological approaches, and next conferences exploring other aspects of history and remembrance research being held annually. So we started looking for potential partners, and as it soon turned out, there were two PhD academics who had already a detailed concept of the first conference, and those were Małgorzata Pakier and Joanna Wawrzyniak. They laid the intellectual foundations for the venture and are still on board, for which I'm very grateful.
It's hard to believe it has been already 10 years of the Genealogies of Memory. I remember our beginnings with kind of nostalgia. At the time, there have been a lot of memory studies, interest and initiative underground here in Poland, including my home Institute of Sociology, University of Warsaw, where the tradition of research on collective memory can be traced back to the interwar period. But 10 years ago, it was also the very special moment of the so-called third wave of memory studies internationally. And as fresh PhDs, we had a feeling it was important to somehow connect our research here with what was being done in the memory studies in the wider international space. It was thanks to the support of the ENRS that this dream of international academic journey came true very quickly. Thanks to the genealogies, we were very lucky in connecting with renowned German scholars working in different disciplines of memory studies, as Aleida Assmann in cultural studies, Stefan Trebst in comparative history, Lutz Nithammer and Alexander von Plato in the field of oral history. Also, at the beginning, the scholars from the US were extremely helpful, especially Jeffrey Olich from the University of Virginia, today the co-president of the Memory Studies Association, who have generously supported us with his expertise for several years. But also, we've always wanted to reach beyond Europe and US to get to know scholars from other regions of the world, from Middle East, East Asia, Southeastern Asia, and Latin America, in order to see what are memory patterns these regions have that we can tackle comparatively or transnationally with Eastern and Central Europe. For instance, our collaboration with Ji-Hyun Lim, a professor of transnational history at Sogang University, Seoul, has been important for us, as Korean history is so similar to the Polish one in the respect of working through foreign dependencies and working through the authoritarian experience. I could go on with names of distinguished scholars who gave keynote lectures or participated in our numerous roundtables, but I think the most important achievement of the Genealogies of Memory program was to provide a venue for younger scholars from Eastern Central Europe at which they could get to know each other and collaborate with each other. Some of them met at our conferences and later started to work together on common topics. Overall, I think programs like this are extremely important in their support for the academic networking that helps to strengthen the research agenda and research careers of younger researchers. So I'm very grateful to the ENRS for its persistent support of the Genealogies of Memory.
program's ambition has been to define the specificity of the mnemonic dynamics and processes in the Central and Eastern Europe, while at the same time to view it from a fresh, comparative perspective in relation to other regions of the globe. We always wanted to explore the interdisciplinarity of memory studies and to go even farther beyond it, and so we asked questions about the relation between memory and such domains of social life as economics, law, art, or religion. There is this epigram by the philosopher Tadeusz Kotarbiński about a dilemma between seeing clearly while staying at the shallow level and searching deep though seeing darkness. And this is what I wish to our next conferences, the courage to ask big questions.